encounter. Our guest tonight is Dr. Marc Ellis. He is an American. He is of the Jewish faith. He is a professor of religious studies at the Maryknoll School of Theology, which is a Catholic school of theology in New York State. We've asked Dr. Ellis to be with us tonight because he has a field of interest which is particularly, I think, interesting and relevant to the people in the region today. He has done a lot of writing about and lecturing and speaking about the whole question of Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab relations, the role of the Holocaust in Jewish thinking and in the state of Israel, and what needs to be done for there to be genuine peace in the region and redemption and justice for all people. He's written several books. Two of his most recent ones are Toward the Jewish Theology of Liberation, and his most recent book, which has just come out, is Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power. So, Dr. Marc Ellis, welcome to Jordan, and we're glad to have you with us on Encounter.
Thank you, and it's good to be here.
We don't often have American Jewish intellectuals on our show or visiting our country, and we wanted you to be with us because of your interesting perspective on these issues. Tell us first how you came to write about the question of Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab ties and the Holocaust, and what brought you to this point, and then give us a quick review of the general thesis that you present.
Well, it started a long time ago, actually, when I was a child. I remember my Hebrew school teacher who wanted me to be a Jewish leader and always wanted me to get my hair cut to look appropriate for that role. He had just been to Israel. It was in 1968, right after the '67 war, when many Jews began to go and to be brought there to see what was going on, to affirm the Jewish state. And he came back, and he was telling me how beautiful Israel was, and I didn't know much about it. But I had just read an article in Time magazine about Palestinians, and I didn't know who they were either. I was just a young boy. And so I asked him about these Palestinians, what about them? And I can remember him looking at me and shaking his finger. You don't know anything. You've never been there. And so I wasn't quite sure where it was at that age, but I said to myself I didn't like that to be told to me, and that I would go one day. And in 1973, when I was in Europe studying for a year, I went. And when I got off the plane in Tel Aviv and then in Jerusalem, I saw that something fundamental was wrong, that people who looked like me were walking around there, and then people who didn't look like me, that is Arabs as I knew them then, Palestinians, were quite different in culture, and it looked like people who looked like me were dominating.
That was obvious to you at first sight?
It was obvious to me at first sight, and really since then I've tried to understand that situation and its relationship to Jewish history. And as I got older and into the 1980s, I began to feel that it was time for me to speak, to learn more, to speak, and to write. And Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, the first article I wrote was in '84, and the book was written in '86 and published in May of '87, before the uprising. But I had a sense that there was a moment coming where we had a choice, maybe the last choice.
We meaning
the Jewish
people.
To turn in a different direction. And that's when the Intifada came, and I think it did give us that choice.
I read Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation a couple of years ago, and I was very struck by it because it was the first major instance, I think, of a book-length work by a Jewish person who was saying the same thing that we were saying, that if there was going to be justice and peace and a normal life in this region, there had to be, people had to live in honesty and mutual respect, that there could not be two standards of morality, and the Israelis could not continue telling us about the Holocaust and about the First Temple and the Second Temple and the Romans and the Russians and the Spaniards and all the problems they had historically, and come dump it all in our lap as Arabs and Palestinians and people of this region. So I was struck by that. Give our viewers a quick overview of your basic ideas about the role of the Holocaust, what you call Holocaust theology, in Israeli and Jewish thinking today, and how they use it to to do bad things to the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think it's good to go back again to my childhood, because when I was 5, I started Hebrew school at an Orthodox synagogue. And I can remember hearing in the background about this tremendous suffering. This was in the 1950s, that we had just undergone this terrible slaughter. And I was taught that I was part of the surviving generation of Jews. But the Holocaust that's central to Jewish life, and Israel is central, was not named until the 1967 war. Israel was there as a child as well, but it was a small place that we contributed money to, but it wasn't central. And really in the 67 war, both Holocaust, our suffering, and Israel, our empowerment, was named. And this theology became very important. And in fact, at Florida State University, I studied with one of the major Holocaust theologians, Richard Rubenstein. And in college, at the age of 19, when I took my first course with him, he named that for me, our suffering. But over time, through my experiences, I began to realize that for them, Israel was a dream. Our suffering was where they were rooted, but Israel was a dream. But I also realized that Israel was not only a dream, but it also could be a nightmare. And as I got to meet Palestinians and know them and see their faces and hear their stories, I realized that for Palestinians, Israel has always been a nightmare. So I had to try to figure out what Holocaust theology said to Jews that was not only relevant but deep, and what it wasn't saying to us. I found out it told us about our suffering, but it didn't tell us about our power. And therefore, I said to myself, we need a new theology which not only speaks about our suffering, but our power, and the use of that power to oppress another people, that is the Palestinian people, and how the Holocaust can be manipulated to further that oppression.
And that's what you think was going on among the Jewish community around the world and in Israel?
I think it's still going on. I think suffering of any people can be used essentially in 2 ways. You have a choice. You can either use it as a blunt instrument, oh, you've never suffered like we've suffered, which is a common Jewish theme.
Yes.
Or you can use it as a path of solidarity to understand somebody else's suffering. And in the beginning of Holocaust theology, really, it's interesting. There was this theme of trying to understand other people's suffering as well as our own, so that early Holocaust theology, that is in the late 60s and 70s, said never again should Jews suffer, but never again should any people suffer like we had. There was only one problem. It never talked about the suffering of Palestinians, the very suffering we were causing. So it was kind of a universal sense of suffering. No, we shouldn't. No one should. But the particular suffering that we were causing went unnoticed and unspoken. And the new theology has as its center the speaking of this suffering that we're causing, which then asks us to reflect back on our suffering and say, well, okay, never again should we suffer, which I believe. Never again should any people suffer the way we had suffered, especially the Palestinian people who are suffering at our hands.
But the reality today is that Israel is a very powerful country militarily,
Yes.
economically with the American support and others, and politically in many ways, though that may be changing these days, we don't know.
When Holocaust theology is spoken, and I think this is important, it reminds us who we were. It tells us that we are weak and helpless.
Yes,
We were.
You
But we're
were,
not now.
and you got badly hurt. I mean, not only in the Holocaust under the Nazis, but under the previous pogroms and discrimination and problems in Russia and medieval Europe and other places. But even with this strength that Israel has, it's been able to assert itself in the region for the last 40, 45 years, it still projects an image of Jews as vulnerable, Jews as people who have been killed, and Jews who can only live with the power of the gun.
Yeah.
How?
Well, the most difficult word in our vocabulary is power. Because of our powerlessness for 2,000 years, in a short space of time, we have become relatively powerful. In this region, very powerful. But you'll rarely get a Jewish thinker to say, we have power. And that's exactly what we need to say, and we need religious thought which will help us say that. Holocaust theology always tells us we're weak and helpless. So we need a theology that is more in consonance with our situation today.
And you are suggesting a Jewish theology of liberation. What do you mean by that?
Well, essentially, what I mean by that is a question. Very Jewish to ask a question. Has our empowerment in Israel brought us liberation? Or has that empowerment, the way it has been worked out, brought us another form of enslavement? Okay, so you say an oppressed people needs power, pursues that power, gets the power, but then has to think whether this form of power is liberating us. Not to mention the Palestinians. And my own view is that unless Palestinians are free, we're never going to be liberated. So that our empowerment, which I affirm, can become a dead end. And it's interesting that it's a dead end for Palestinians and for us, which means to me that we have an interlocking destiny, Palestinian and Jew. And therefore, if we can see this interlocking destiny, we can move beyond empowerment, which has become enslavement, to a form of liberation.
Mutual liberation.
Mutual liberation.
And mutual security.
And mutual security, where we feel rooted in the world, wherever we live. It's interesting, Israel was supposed to end our sense of isolation and fear. It's exaggerated it. Israel was supposed to be a haven. It's the most dangerous place for a Jew to live in the world. Now, our theology still sees it as a dream.
Yes.
But when we get to the concrete, it's something other than what it was supposed to be.
How do you reconcile what Israel is doing as a state today with traditional Jewish morality as revealed in the Old Testament and the Jewish prophetic tradition?
Well, it's failing.
Or let me put it another way: if Moses was around today, what would he think?
Well, I don't know. I don't usually think in biblical imagery, but I do think it's fair to say that one of the central themes in Jewish life is ethics. It's not the only theme. But if that is a central theme, which I believe it is, it's obvious that there is a tremendous contradiction between these ethical understandings and the way we're living. And I think all of us know it. I think every Jew in the world knows it. And many,
they don't come to terms with it.
Well, it's very frightening, because if Israel isn't the answer, if Holocaust isn't the center, the only center, who are we? We've built our identity and our status over the last 40 years, especially over the last 20 or so years, on these issues of Holocaust in Israel. So if we realize this now, that the Holocaust was horrible and terrible and needs always to be remembered, but the lesson is not simply our empowerment, especially an empowerment which oppresses another people, then what do? I say we talk to those whom we have oppressed.
The Palestinians.
We confess to the Palestinian people that what we did to them was wrong, and we begin a process of reconciliation with justice, which will help free Palestinians and free us. That's the way out. That's the only way out.
Sort of collective redemption, cleansing of the soul, living by the morality that Arabs and Israelis share through their religious traditions.
We can more closely approximate it. I'm not looking for perfection. But until we confess to the Palestinian people, we will never be free. No matter the rhetoric, it gets louder and louder, more bellicose. And this rhetoric and these actions are a scandal to Jewish history. And that's what they'll be remembered for, as scandals to Jewish history.
It's interesting today that the Israelis are still not only exacting financial retribution from people in Europe who were involved in the Holocaust and anti-Jewish actions, but they're now demanding new apologies. I think the latest one from the Ukraine. They're asking the Ukrainians to apologize to the Jews. Do I have a right equally to ask the Jews to apologize to me as a Palestinian, as an Arab?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I don't mind, this is a bias I have, to ask Ukrainians to apologize, to confess. I use confession.
Because they did something terrible.
Oh, it's awful, and they should. But unfortunately, we also have to confess, and we're very good at pointing the fingers at others, but we don't like the finger pointed at us. And this is one of the themes in my second book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption. We still go around the world as if we are innocent, suffering victims. But we're not innocent anymore. And in this case, Palestinians are innocent, just as we were innocent during the Holocaust. And we just can't seem to get it through our head that when we have power, and this is something I didn't want to admit as a child, when we have power, we do exactly what was done against us.
So the whole idea of the Jews as having a sort of a special morality or a higher calling or something of this nature, in your view, that is disproven by the way Jews act, or Israelis act, or the Israeli government?
Well, it's not just Israel. I don't want to just point the finger at Israel, because our entire community, Jewish leadership, the Jewish professionals who are often professional religious, who are often called rabbis, and Jewish educators who are often called professors, and I reserve those terms when they're lived out rather than just apply them because of ordination or position. Our whole community is organized to destroy the Palestinian people in Palestine. So how could I say to you that we were chosen, that we have a higher ethical reality? If I'd like to tell you, I can't. Objectively, I have to say, it is not true that we act like anyone else when we have power, and we don't admit it, just like anyone else.
Do you think that this manner of Israeli behavior or Jewish behavior, if what you're saying is correct, is starting to have an impact in the West, a backlash perhaps? People are getting tired of Israel's obstinacy and its stubbornness in peace talks. People are getting tired of the strength of pro-Israeli lobbyists in Washington who needle the president. Do you see any backlash?
I think the traveling around the United States and being on local radio talk shows, really getting a feel for the people, I think the support for Israel in the United States is about an inch deep.
It's very thin.
I think it's very thin. And I think that Israel is in a very precarious situation. They've got a tremendous amount of power, but Israel is really a ghetto in the Middle East, very dependent on American money and power, which is dependent on elite support both from the Jewish and Christian communities in the United States. There are a lot of Jews who are fed up in the United States, and a lot of Christians who are fed up, and the State Department's fed up. I think they're in a very dangerous situation, and Jewish leaders are leading us down a path which not only harms the Palestinian people, but is going to destroy us, and is putting in danger those people who live in Israel. And so often in the United States, the discussion is not about the concrete facts of Israel and Palestine. It's about how we feel about ourselves. Are we good people? But you're saying we're doing things wrong. Does that make us bad people? And I say the best thing to do is simply face who we have become, which raises the question, do we want to be like this forever? Or do we want to choose another way of being in the world?
Do you see any signs within Israel, and let's just talk about Israel now, of a new generation coming up, people that were not directly coming out of the Holocaust, but people who were born in the last, say, 20, 25 years in Israel? Any signs that they may be taking a different attitude, that they may see the reality that you're talking about?
I think the next generation may be worse than the older generation, because remember, the older generation was born outside, and although their experience was difficult, very difficult, they still had another experience of the world. The Jewish Israelis who have been born in Israel and have grown up there know Arabs and Palestinians basically in only one way, as enemy. And they're the people that they've been surrounded by. Therefore, it might be that they may be less able to deal in a flexible way. They have less knowledge of the world.
But isn't it possible, I mean, I would hope that it's possible, I personally believe it is, that you could have something in Israel similar to F.W. de Klerk, the leader of South Africa, where after many, many decades of the suppression of the blacks, they would start to wake up to the reality that their power structure, their oppression of another people is untenable. or even to what Gorbachev did in Eastern Europe. The pattern of the past cannot be maintained forever.
Yeah, I think those two cases are instructive. I would love to tell you that both leaders came to a moral decision about power, but that wouldn't be true.
No, it was a practical reality. It was forced on them.
Now, the question would be whether or not Israel is a South Africa situation or a Soviet Union situation. And from South Africans, I've often heard, and I thought, gee, this is kind of strange, that Israel will be more difficult than South Africa. Well, one is the South Africans, black South Africans, are a majority. So they're going to win one day, whether it's in 2 years or 10 years or 30 years. The whites are finished there. All they can do is negotiate a settlement. But I think it's more difficult in Israel and Palestine. I think there's something there that is even more relentless than apartheid. And unless they are forced from the outside to stop, I do not believe that Israel will stop. That is, it will take a certain power to stop Israel in order for Israel to end its occupation of the Palestinians.
You've mentioned in your writings two possibilities. One, very strong American political economic pressure. The other, some kind of external military force. Are you thinking of a regional military force or even foreign intervention?
Well, I was thinking, I mean, people say that, some Jewish progressives think that's an outlandish thought. Well, here we have an occupation over 2 decades long. It's a permanent occupation. The UN resolutions, it's against international law, it's even against U.S. foreign policy, which is not exactly progressive foreign policy. But when do you say enough? So any other state, you would have to consider economic sanctions, boycott, aid, and ultimately military intervention. And I was for the transfer of troops, American troops from Saudi Arabia to Jerusalem to give birth to a Palestinian state. And I think that anyone who is not willing to think in those ways, including the boycott, sanctions, end of foreign aid, or even ultimately military intervention, is not serious.
You don't think Israel will budge otherwise?
Only through power from the United States, if it's in the United States' interests to force Israel. That's my view.
You don't hold out any possibility that the Israeli people somehow, through seeing the reality around them, through the recent experience of putting on gas masks in the Gulf War, through whatever moral pressures or processes that they may undergo, that they might see the reality, see that they are 4.5 million in a sea of 215 million Arabs, and change their ways?
I would love to tell you that Jews around the world, including Jews in Israel, would come to this moral and practical conclusion by themselves. I think they will come to the conclusion once we're forced to stop. Once they're forced to stop. I think then we will, over the years, realize that it was a good thing that we were forced to stop. But I do not believe that we will stop on our own accord. And I think Jewish progressives who hold that as a possibility are either under an illusion themselves or trying to give an illusion to somebody else. I think in political affairs, let's face it, they're going to go as far as they can until they can't go any further. Now, if the Arab world had been militarily able to stop them, we wouldn't be having this discussion. The problem is they haven't been. And Israel, and in general, has a free reign. But it has a free reign only as long as the United States funds it. So I say, stop the aid to Israel now. For the sake of Palestinians, first and foremost, and for our sake, because I believe that the destruction of Palestinians in Palestine will also destroy the tradition that I grew up with just 30-some years ago.
Of course, my agony, my physical agony is your moral agony.
Right. Now, I want to make it clear. I'm not arguing that Palestinians should be free, so I'll feel good about myself. I will feel better about myself. But I think even when this is over, even if Palestinians become free in their own homeland, we can't just shove you away, Palestinians, and say, we don't want, see you again, see you again. Thank God you're out of our life so we can reclaim our moral superiority and our innocence. I think we have to face you and realize that in Jewish history, we can do what has been done to us. That's why it's so crucial for Western Christians to have to face live Jews. They love Old Testament Jews because they're dead Jews, and they can manipulate them. They have to face us face to face. In many places, in some places in Europe, no. They took care of the situation. We have to face Palestinians because it shows us what we're capable of doing as a people, and therefore is a lesson for a different direction that we should take.
The events taking place now in the United States and Europe, especially the President Bush's suspension of the delay of 4 months of discussing the $10 billion loan guarantees to Israel, do you see these as signs of a beginning of a change in mentality in the American government?
Well, since the Intifada, the public discussion in the United States has changed on this issue. Things that couldn't be said are said. Places to speak which weren't available are now available. So Bush and Baker were able to make this political decision, partly because the discussion has changed. But we won't know how much until Bush either stands pat and really says this is it, or whether he caves in. So the question is not so much, could Bush make the statement now, but in 6 months to a year, what will he be doing? Remember, elections are going to be coming up. He's running for president again. So we'll know about the public discussion, because I think Bush and Baker want to do this, not for the sake of the Palestinians and not for the sake of the Jews. But Palestinians and Jews have become too disturbing a factor in the Middle East. So the U.S. foreign policy elite wants us both to quiet down.
Well, they just sent 500,000 troops and watched Kuwait burning and problems in the region, and so I think they're realizing the consequences of letting the region continue in this trend of violence and injustice and militarism.
But that's why we have to keep working in the U.S. We have to make it possible for Bush to stand on this statement of principle and political reality. We've got to back it. And as a person growing up, as a Jew, I never knew a Jewish Republican, and it was almost a sin. But I'll tell you, on this issue, I back President Bush and Secretary Baker completely. They have my full backing, because this is the critical issue to the future of the Palestinians and the Jewish people.
The peace camp in Israel, Peace Now, the Yossi Sarids, the Mapam people, the Shinui, all the lefties, the Labor Party, the little small left-wing parties, some of the religious peaceniks. You've written quite almost mockingly of them. You sort of dismiss them as not really being serious about genuine justice and peace and reaching out to the Palestinians. Why do you look at the Israeli peace camp with such skepticism?
Well, I wouldn't say mockingly. I would say that I'm interested in a justice camp in Israel, not a peace camp. And I would say that many of them are not serious. Some of them are serious, but they're caught in a contradiction. They've come to live in Israel, not to live with Palestinians. Zionism is not for Palestinians. So they now have come to a conclusion that maybe a Palestinian state is important, but it's basically to get Palestinians away from us. I think also we have to understand that no matter how courageous some of them are, they're not going to win in Israel. I don't think some of them want to win, but they're not going to win. And I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying it's too late now to wait for the Israeli political process. Because in 5 years, what's going to be left of Palestine? What's left now? Are they even talking about Jerusalem? No. How big is Jerusalem going to be? It's going to become the biggest city in the world, not population-wise, but area-wise. It's going to stretch into Jordan if they can get it.
Yeah.
So let's stop lying to ourselves. Let's stop the illusions. They're not going to do it.
But
It'd be great if they did, but they're not going to do it.
But I think the whole point of the current attempts to start a peace negotiation is to check Zionism, to halt it in its tracks, and to say, let's get to the peace negotiating table. We have an international consensus, UN resolutions, Land for Peace, 242, the whole thing. And let's stop this growing political cancer in the region, this Zionism that is taking over all of Palestine, part of Syria, part of Lebanon, little bits of Jordan in the south they have, and check it, and then deal with it in the longer term in terms of reconciliation and coexistence.
Well, I think the peace process is different than the peace camp. But the peace process, insofar as it looks to peace between the Arab states and Israel, there already is peace. Who's kidding who? Israel has been a significant player in the region for 40 years, and everybody knows it.
Well, it's not peace. You have occasional wars.
You have occasional wars, but basically it's a status quo.
With the Arab countries, you're saying?
With the Arab countries and with the Arab governments. This is a whole other issue. But the question of the Palestinians is quite different. Sure, Israel would like peace with Syria. Does Syria want to get into a war with Israel? Or Egypt? Or Lebanon? Or Jordan? The question is the Palestinians. And on that issue, Israeli state power is not going to budge. When they talk about possible autonomy, they're talking about collecting garbage. They're talking about running your own water system. Not funding it, by the way, of course. That all has to come from outside.
Yes.
So they might say, well, look, if they're smart, what they would say is, well, let's take 5 years and talk about autonomy. But what's going to be left in 5 years?
Yeah, but that's the whole point of trying to engage in a peace negotiation, to check this process and to tell them, you may want this, you Israelis, but you can't have this, because the whole world says there must be Palestinian self-determination, withdrawal from the occupied territory, non-acquisition of land for peace. There are scores and scores of UN Security Council resolutions, mandatory and unanimous, with the U.S. and everybody voting for them. The annexation of Jerusalem is not recognized, the Golan, the educational changes they've made, the acquisition of land, everything that Israel has done is clearly opposed by the world, the whole world. Yeah. But not very much is done about it. So I think the idea now is to let's put these at the center of the political debate. The world went nuts implementing UN resolutions in Kuwait. We've got the same resolutions for Palestine, and called the moral bluff of the world in a way.
Well, the United States has recognized these resolutions and often voted for them and has continued to fund Israel because it was in the perceived foreign policy interests of the United States. Now, if that changes, if the U.S. foreign policy interest changes, then we might have some implementation. Forget morality about it. The U.S. will implement those resolutions when it wants to.
When it serves its purpose.
When it serves its purposes. Now, there's a hope, with U.S. troops already here, which the U.S. has wanted for years, that might diminish the importance of Israel militarily. With the Soviet Union on its knees, it gives the U.S. the chance to rearrange the checkerboard here. I'm not in favor of that, but that's the way it is. The U.S. wants a certain status quo. If Palestinians are too troublesome, or Israelis, then something's got to be done. But the UN resolutions have been on the books. They'll be implemented when the U.S. decides that Israel is out of hand. And that, I don't know when will happen. It may happen tomorrow. It may never happen. But Israel's not going to stop because of those UN resolutions. Those go back to the 1940s.
Of course.
And no one in the region has the power to stop them.
Yeah, so far that's been the case.
So, and in the foreseeable future.
What is happening among the leadership of the American Jewish community, the sort of mainstream traditional leadership? Are there any signs of deep questioning, of reassessment of Israel's policies?
I think there's personal questioning. I think a number of Jewish leaders feel that Israel has betrayed its own mission and betrayed their dream of Israel. But on the political level, although some critical comments are made, there's support down the line. And you talk about the Soviet Jewish immigration, for instance. During Yom Kippur, when we should have been confessing our sins against the Palestinian people, there was this whole drive to get the loan guarantee approved. Now, anyone who deals with the situation in Israel and Palestine knows that the Soviet Jewish immigration is one of the last nails in the coffin of the Palestinian people. So how can you argue for unlimited Soviet Jewish immigration to Israel and also be in favor of a Palestinian state? Where are these Jews going to live? Where are these settlements being built? So they're not able to take the situation at hand and really go for it. Partly, I think they don't care that much, and partly they're afraid. And I think they're afraid that if they make the wrong decision and Israel goes down, they fear a second Holocaust, and the blame will be on them.
Don't the American Jewish leaders look to the future? I mean, the Israelis may not, but Jews in the United States and Canada and Europe, they can look ahead. They can see the reality of a small Israeli state with a small population in the middle of an Arab world. We had the Crusader analogy. There were many other analogies of foreign people who came and established a beachhead. Militarily, they were strong. And then, with time, they couldn't maintain a political order based on military dominance. Don't American Jewish people look ahead and realize that Israel has to come to terms with its Arab neighbors in a more rational way?
Well, I think one of the problems is that much of the discussion in the United States on the question of Israel among American Jews is not about Israel. It's about the way we are perceived and the way we feel and the way we are received in American society. So most Jews in America are totally ignorant, including a lot of Jewish leaders, including a lot of progressive Jews, ignorant about the situation.
In the Middle East?
In the Middle East. Our home is in the United States and Canada and England. That's where our future is. And as Israelis, Jewish Israelis often point out, it's interesting. Our future is in the Middle East. Your future is there. So the discussion really isn't about the realities so much of what it's going to be like in 50 years. And when you have an empire, which Israel has empiric strength in the Middle East, empires never think about the future, except that it's theirs. All empires think that the future is theirs. Now, we know, of course, in history, that all empires fall, and all empires lose. And it is true, I think, that if Israel were to lose, and lose big, that could be it. So I argue, while you have power, and how long will they have power? Go for peace now. And the only bridge for peace in the Middle East for Jews is the Palestinians. And you know, when you look at the Iraq War, there's an article in the Village Voice by a Jewish American woman, and it's titled War Now. Not Peace Now, War Now. So you saw a lot of the true colors of the Jewish world in that sense in Iraq. And so you ask yourself, how are Jews around the world going to come to grips with this state that we have, which isn't run by us, and isn't controlled by American Jewish leaders, and isn't even controlled by Jewish Israelis? Now, of course, state power is like that. In the United States, if you're on the left, you're not controlling state power either. But this is the most important issue for the history of the Jewish people. And that history is being systematically destroyed by what Israel's doing.
And Israel is doing this, why? Because it's driven by fear, but still clinging to this image of Jews as powerless victims?
No, I don't think so. I think this thing of fear is overplayed. Jewish Israelis, especially the generals, and as you notice, almost everybody in Israel is a general, because we haven't had generals for 2,000 years, right? They know exactly what power is. They're very calculating, and they laugh at American Jews with this dream of Israel. They want the land. They want the land to settle it. Listen, if the Palestinians are driven out completely out of Palestine, that is not an aberration in Jewish-Israeli history. It would be in continuity. If they're stopped, that's an aberration. So they want everything there, and they're going to go until they're stopped. And unless people realize that, and this is why we can never have a discussion in the United States, because you can never say that about Israel in the United States. Israel's peace-loving. The Arabs are rejectionists.
Democracy.
Democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. But if you look at it outside, what's happened over the last 50 years? Has Israel been diminished? Have they stopped? Or have they gone and gone and gone? And not Likud. Every policy that Likud has was pioneered by labor. They just spoke nicer.
Yes. Do you see any signs of this kind of reconciliation reaching out from Israelis to Palestinians, this sort of mutual redemption and security that that you talk about. Any signs of it? Do you see pockets of sanity?
Well, in the Intifada, especially at the beginning, listening to both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, there was, on a very small level, but a significant level, reaching out. Medical equipment, drugs for the wounded. These are obviously not things to be happy about because the Palestinians were suffering so much, but there were Jews, of course, that reached out. But here we're not talking about the special Jews or the Jews and Palestinians who were friends. That's terrific and important. What we're talking about is a policy that is systematically eliminating Palestinians from Palestine. So of course you have personal relationships. I mean, I have friends who are Palestinians, and it's great. But that's not really the issue.
Yes.
The issue is how do we stop the power that makes victims out of Palestinians and really makes victims out of us in a different way, and forces Jews to do things that we really don't want to do. Just as other state power often forces other people to do things that they really don't want to do. So the personal friendships and the signs of reaching out are good and important, but we have to look at the central issue, which is state power in Israel, with the assent of world Jewish leadership and the United States so far.
Yes. Are there any pockets of people in Israel, any differences among the communities, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, the religious, the secular, the right, the left, whatever, that shows substantial differences?
Well, everybody usually blames the other one for the demise of Israel. When you get inside of the Jewish-Israeli society, the whole thing's going down the tubes. Everybody knows it, and everybody's blaming the secular, blame the religious blame the secular, the European blames the Oriental, and the Oriental the European. All I know is this. The state has been dominated by European progressive socialists from the beginning. And what was progressive and socialist from Europe has been a disaster for the Palestinians. That's what I know. Now the question is how can we change that disaster into something at least more positive? But I think that the idea that Likud is dragging Israel down is an illusion. They're just carrying out and is more strident in policies that were pioneered. And when European background Jews often say, look, the Oriental Jews, they vote for Likud and that's the end of Israel. It's an illusion. They just don't understand what they've done before them. And when the secular say it about the religious or the religious the secular use the religious. They think, a lot of them think they're nuts, but they use them for their public policy. Or when they want to say it's not us, it's them. It's an illusion.
What would you suggest in practical terms? What can individual people do, Israelis, Americans, Arabs, to promote this process that you would like to see happen?
Well, I think it's dependent on American power. I know that's a very American point of view, but that's where I've come. And so anything that can support, for instance, President Bush and Secretary Baker at this point, anyone that will increase the influence on American foreign policy in a positive direction, Jew or otherwise. The Palestinians' Intifada is very important. The PLO, all of that is very important. The Arab governments. It's basic, though, to force the U.S. to end aid to Israel and end military support to Israel if it doesn't stop. So whatever influences that, I think at this point in history, is most important. And maybe a lot of different things will have gone into that. But also to change the public discussion in the United States to affect public policy. So anything that brings together elements to pressure the U.S. to stop supporting Israeli expansionism, which is against our articulated policy, that will help.
You must not be very popular among American Jewish leaders. What kind of personal reaction do you get when you talk about these ideas and make these suggestions? Do you, but at the same time, you get invited to speak a lot.
I get invited to speak a lot, and I'm published a lot, and increasingly by Jewish groups, including some rabbis. I think that Jewish leadership would like you to believe that no one would support someone like me, but it's nonsense. There are Jews all over the United States, and in Israel too, who agree with parts or a lot of what I'm saying, and who might say it themselves, but most of them aren't public speakers or writers, because there's a penalty to be paid, and the Jewish community makes sure that you understand that penalty. And many who have spoken out in the past, we have a whole tradition of dissent, have been squashed. So I represent as many people as Jewish leadership does, but they would have you think that I represent no one. And that also is their illusion. So we're both minorities. And I think it's a fight, and I think it's really a civil war. But the ones that will also help to limit dissent are Jewish progressives, many of whom you and other people interested in this deal with all the time. Good people, but in a way they function to limit the dissent, even as they think they're making it.
If we look back at the Gulf War experience, we were sitting here in Amman in rooms sealed in plastic with our children watching TV, wondering whether there's going to be gas and attacks and is from Israel or from Iraq or from wherever. And we turned on our TV and we watched the Israelis sitting in their sealed rooms with their gas masks. And, you know, it became clear to me that we had reached this sort of moral degradation, in a way, this depravity, where we had both, you know, the Israelis, the Jews, the Arabs, Christians, Muslims, had reached this pit, this moral pit. We were sitting around in plastic rooms, watching each other on TV and trying to kill each other. It was mad. And we are the people who gave the world morality and ethics and religion and gods, you know. And doesn't this make an impact on the Israelis, do you think, or Jews around the world? Why would the Iraqis want to send Scud missiles against Israel? They wouldn't have done that 100 years ago. There was a thriving Jewish community in Iraq. And historically, there had been for thousands of years, or hundreds of years. And suddenly, we reached this point. A year or so later now, what is the assessment? What do you think Jews and Israelis feel when they consider that? Or do they even think about it?
Well, I think the lesson is obvious. But there are other lessons that can be drawn, too.
What is the lesson?
The lesson is obvious. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's got to stop. And I'm sure many Jews around the world want it to stop. But you have state power and a certain public discussion in Israel, which also might say, okay, now we go and take it all. Now you might say, okay, you'll never be safe. You'll always be in that room, which I happen to agree with you.
They'll have to carry their gas masks around for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, in a figurative and literal sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I say it's mad. Now, it's also mad to come from our history and then try to destroy another people. So it's silly, it's absurd, it's mad. It doesn't provide for the security of either Palestinian or Jew. So change direction.
The cycle of madness has to be broken.
Has to be broken. But my own feeling is, and my own understanding is, that the state of Israel and Jewish leaders around the world either want to continue this in the hope that they can bring in an end through further territory, or are silent about it, or want to keep others silent. And we haven't even broached that subject about how our use of the Holocaust and our desires about Israel keeps others who are non-Jews from speaking in the West. So that's madness too. And I say to them, hey, speak up. If you care about Jews and you care about Palestinians, speak up to break this cycle. But we're not going to be able to break it ourselves for many, many reasons. We're going to need help. We're going to have to be forced. If that's unpopular, it's unpopular. We get Jewish Israelis in the United States begging us to stop them. Not Jewish leaders in the traditional sense, the non-elected elite leaders, but ordinary Jewish Israelis saying, stop us before it's too late. And I say that too. Before it's too late. And already it may be too late.
Marc Ellis, thanks very much for being with us. It's been a pleasure, and let's hope that your ideas get some stimulating thought and assessment and consideration around the region.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
That's it for tonight's encounter. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next week. Good night.